You can simply Google for Firebase Auth REST API, and you should find an article in the official docs which gives you an overview over the REST endpoints Firebase offers to you for creating users and logging users in. Here on the right, you see the different things you can do with that backend, with that REST API Firebase offers you. It's a different REST API than we used before. It's not our database REST API we created automatically. It's a dedicated authentication API offered by Firebase. And we need only two methods: signing users up with email and password and signing users in with email and password. So of course, let's start with signing users up, because we can't sign in if we have no users, right? This is the URL to which you need to send your request. So this is the URL we'll have to send a request to with this data, with the email, password, and then this return secure token thing, which we also have to add to our request body, which is a Boolean that essentially should always be true. Firebase just needs that. You can ignore that. Your API might not need that. Now we'll get back a response with, for example, the email address, the ID of the user, because Firebase automatically creates a new unique ID for each user. And we also get back that ID token, which is that token I mentioned on the slide earlier. So Firebase already gives us such a token once we sign a user up. We don't even need to sign in thereafter. We automatically get the token when the user is signed up. We also get an expires in field, which tells us how long that token will be valid, because for security reasons, these tokens will expire. For Firebase, for example, they at the moment expire after 1 hour. Thereafter, you either have to refresh them, which we'll not cover here, or log in again. Back to this URL though. We need to send this request, and that screams for a new service here that actually deals with that request sending. So in the auth folder, I'll add my auth service.ts file, which is a service that will be responsible for signing users up, signing users in, and managing that token of my user. In that auth service file, let's therefore export a class auth service, and that service will receive the @injectable decorator, which is imported from @AngularCore, where I will use that shortcut for providing it by setting provided into root in that object we can pass to injectable. The alternative would be to add it to the providers array of the app module. Now in that auth service, we can of course start relatively simple by adding one method, a sign up method. And this method should do just what the name suggests. It should sign the user up. It should send a request to that sign up URL. Therefore, we will need the Angular HTTP client, of course. And this needs to be injected. So let's add the constructor, and now make sure you got @injectable here. Even if you provided the service in the providers array of the app module, as soon as you inject the service into a service, you need @injectable, not necessarily with that object being passed to it, but you need the @injectable decorator itself. And now we can inject the HTTP client, which I'll store in a private property named HTTP, and the type will be HTTP client, and it's imported from @angular/common/HTTP. In the signup method, we can now use the HTTP client to send let's have a look at the documentation, post request here. Send a post request to that URL, so copy that URL here, and here we'll use the post method, and then send a request to this URL. Now, please note that in this URL, we got that API key thing, which in the end is just something you have to replace with your Firebase API key. And you can find that Firebase API key in your Firebase web console. And there, by clicking on that gear icon under project settings, and then it's this API key here, which you need. You can simply copy and paste that. And then replace API key here, including the square brackets, with that copied key. This is the URL we have to send a request to. Now, since it's a post request, we of course also need to attach some data. So let me attach a JavaScript object here. And that JavaScript object should hold 3 properties, the 3 properties this endpoint expects: email, password, and return secure token. These are the 3 data pieces this backend endpoint requires. And therefore, I'll send my email here. And I do expect to get that here as a string. I also expect to get the password as a string. So I will send the email here, email key, gets the email value here, and then the same for the password, password key gets that password value. The values here are the arguments I'm getting. You could name these differently. Email and password have to be named like this because our API expects exactly these keys. It also expects a return secure token, so you must set this as well. And as you can learn in the official docs, this should always be true. So therefore, let's simply set this to true here. Perfect. So this now will send an HTTP request to that backend here, to this URL. As you learned, the HTTP client does nothing without someone subscribing though. And we're not even calling the signup method anyways. So let's return this prepared observable now so that we can subscribe in the auth component, which is where we might also be interested in getting the response of that. Because if we get an error, we probably want to display an error message. And whilst we're waiting for the response, we might want to show some loading indicator. So therefore, returning the observable such that we know the current state of the request in the auth component makes a lot of sense. We also can define the format of the data we'll get back, because we will get back these 6 fields here. And therefore, I will create a new interface actually here in the auth service, because I only need it in here, and we don't even need to export it therefore. It'll just be an interface which I'll name auth response data, and this interface defines how such an object will look like, how our auth response data will look like, and it will have 6 properties as you learn: kind, ID token, email, refresh token, expires in, and local ID. So let's add all of them. Kind is a string. As you see here, they are all strings. ID token is a string. Email is a string. Then also we got the refresh token and expires in. So refresh token is a string. Expires in is a string. And last but not least, local ID, which is the generated user ID, that also is a string. Now, why am I defining the interface here? It is totally optional. You don't need to do that, but it is a good practice in Angular and in TypeScript apps to define the types of data you're working with. And as you learned in the HTTP client module, when we send an HTTP request with the Angular HTTP client, these methods here, post, get, and so on, these are our generic methods where we can hint which type of data we will get back. And here we know for this post request, we will get back data in this format, which is now exactly the format I stored in this auth response data. And therefore, we can add the angled brackets here and simply pass auth response data here, this interface we just generated, between these angle brackets, so that we inform TypeScript that this post request will yield us a response in which body we find data in this format. And this can be helpful for when we want to work with that response. With that out of the way, in the next lecture, we will actually fire this method from inside our auth component and also make sure we handle potential errors and we handle the loading state correctly. Time to fire that signup method. For that, let's go back to the auth component. And here in onSubmit, before we reset the form, instead of logging our values, I want to extract my email, which I can by accessing form value email. And the same for the password. So my password will be form value password. Of course, you could also add an extra check, first of all, where you check if the form is not valid by adding an exclamation mark, and then you just return. Normally, this method should not be triggered if the form is invalid because we disable the submit button. But if a user should hack away into that and kind of manually enable that button, which you can do with the browser developer tools, of course, well, then we still have this in line, and this still gives us an extra validation step. If the user disables this as well, which would also be possible, well, then the incorrect data will simply be sent to the backend and will fail there. If a user wants a bad user experience and forces himself into that, we can't do anything about this. But having that extra step makes sense, I guess. More importantly, though, we are extracting email and password, and therefore now we need to inject the auth service into the auth component so that we can call that signup method we just added. For that, let's add a constructor and store the auth service in a private property named auth service, like this. Of course, make sure you do import your auth service, therefore. And with the auth service injected in here, let's call this auth service sign up and forward that email and password which you extracted. And thereafter, we can reset that form. Now in the auth service in the last lecture, we set up that sign up method such that it returns this prepared observable, which is ready to send this request here. And therefore, we have to subscribe to the response or to the return value of sign up, which is that observable. Now in that response here, we get our response data if the authentication, if the sign up succeeds. So here, let's simply log the response data for now. And of course, we might also get an error. And for that, let's grab that error and console log that as well if one should occur. Good. With all of that out of the way, this should actually be working. One thing that's missing, by the way, now that I look at this, we'll add it later, is the login mode currently is not respected. At the moment, we always send a sign up request here. Of course, we want to change this. And actually, let's implement it right now already. Let's check this is login mode. If we are logging in, then at the moment we can't do anything because we only added the sign up logic thus far. And therefore, right now, we can only do something in the else block. In the else block, I simply want to send this HTTP request. Here, we can't do anything at the moment. Resetting the form is something I always want to do. So now with that out of the way, let's go back to our user interface. And let's enter our email and the password. And let's try logging in. And that should actually not work. And indeed, we see no output there. So now let's try signing up by switching to sign up and entering our credentials. You can enter any credentials you want. Click sign up, and this looks good. We get back a response which has that kind response, which has that email expires in, that token, which is this cryptic string, local ID, which is that automatically generated user ID. That looks quite good. If we have a look at our Firebase Web Console here under users, and you click that refresh button, you also should see the user here. So this is looking really good, and this seems to work. Now, as an additional check, if you use that exact same data again, or at least the same email address again, now you should get an error because that user already exists. And therefore, here I get a 400 error, where if you dig into that error field, you see I got a code 400 with a message of email exists, which is kind of a code Firebase gives us telling us that this email address already exists. This is something we can now use to handle that error. And I also want to show a loading spinner whilst we are waiting for this to be submitted.